She embarrassed me in front of everyone I loved, so I quietly made one phone call. I still remember the exact moment I knew something was wrong. It was a Sunday afternoon in late October. One of those crisp New England days where the leaves had already turned and the air smelled like wood smoke and cold earth. My son had called ahead to say he was bringing someone special for dinner. He'd been seeing her for about 3 months. I knew that much, but he kept things close to the chest, the way he always did when something mattered to him. I'd spent most of the morning in the kitchen. Beef stew, his favorite since he was 9 years old. I'd picked up a good cut from the butcher on Elm Street, the one I'd been going to for 30 years. I added the pearl onions the way his mother used to. God rest her soul. And I let the whole thing simmer low and slow while I set the dining room table with the good dishes, the ones we only used for company. I was 63 years old, recently retired from 28 years with the city planning department, and living alone in the house where I'd raised my son since his mother passed. The house wasn't much, a colonial on a quarter-acre lot in western Massachusetts, but it was paid off. It was mine, and I was proud of it. When they pulled into the driveway, I watched from the kitchen window. She stepped out first. I noticed 3 things before she even reached the front porch. 1, she was younger than I expected, maybe late 20s. 2, she was already scanning the house the way you scan something you're considering purchasing. Not admiring it, appraising it. And 3, when my son came around the car and reached for her hand, she took it, but her eyes never left the roofline. I told myself I was being a suspicious old man. I went to the door and smiled. "Dad," my son said, "this is Lydia." She shook my hand with a firm grip and smiled back at me. She had a beautiful smile, the kind that reaches the eyes just slightly too late. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you," she said. "Arthur has told me so much." I said all the right things. "Come in, please. Dinner's almost ready. It's cold out there." I hung up her coat. I offered coffee. She asked if I had herbal tea instead, and when I said I only had regular Lipton, she said, "Oh, that's fine," in a tone that suggested it was not entirely fine. We sat down to dinner. My son talked about his new position at the engineering firm, which I was proud of, genuinely proud, and Lydia listened with the patient expression of someone waiting for their turn. When the conversation shifted to her, she talked about her job in real estate, residential sales, she said, and about how the market in our area was really moving right now. "What kind of properties do you work with?" I asked. "Mostly older homes," she said. She glanced around my dining room. "Like this one, actually. Good bones. People don't appreciate what they have sometimes." My son laughed. He thought she was paying me a compliment. I refilled my water glass and said nothing. After dinner, I was washing up and she came to stand in the kitchen doorway. She didn't offer to help. She just stood there, looking at the layout. The original cabinets from 1987, the hardwood floors I'd refinished myself, the bay window that looked out over the backyard. "This place must be worth quite a bit now," she said, "with the way prices have gone up around here." "I suppose," I said. "Arthur mentioned it's just you here." She paused. "Such a big house for one person." I turned off the faucet and dried my hands slowly. "It suits me," I said. She smiled. "Of course. That was the first Sunday. By Christmas, my son had proposed. He told me over the phone, and his voice was so full of joy that I pushed every uncomfortable feeling I had into a drawer and locked it. He was happy. That was what mattered. I told him congratulations and meant it. They set the date for the following September, a venue in the Berkshires, a restored barn that Lydia had found, naturally being in real estate, with 110 guests and a catered dinner and a photographer from Boston. I wrote a check for $15,000 toward the wedding costs, because my son was my son and I would do anything for him. Over the months that followed, I saw Lydia at family gatherings, holidays, the occasional Sunday dinner. Each time I paid attention, I watched how she spoke to my son's friends versus how she spoke to people she thought couldn't help her. I noticed how she redirected conversations about finances back toward the house, my house specifically, with a casualness that was too practiced to be accidental. I noticed how she never quite included me in her plans. Not rudely. just thoroughly. One evening in February, I was in the backyard when I heard her on the phone through the sliding door, which I'd left cracked open. She didn't know I was there. She was talking to someone, a friend, I assumed, and she was speaking quietly but not quietly enough. The house alone is worth $380, maybe $400 with the market right now. His pension covers his basic expenses, and he's not exactly young, so… She heard the door and stopped. I stayed out in the cold for a while after that. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I know I could be the controlling father who never thinks anyone is good enough for his child. I've asked myself that question honestly, but what I heard through that door wasn't a woman talking about building a future. It was a woman calculating an inheritance. I didn't say anything to my son. Not yet. Because I knew him. He was 41 years old. But when he loved someone, he was 22 again, and he would hear criticism as jealousy and concern as interference. He needed more than my suspicion. He needed something he could see for himself. So I waited. And I paid attention. In March, I had coffee with my old colleague Bernard, who'd worked in city records before he retired. I didn't tell him everything, but I asked a few general questions about how to look into someone's financial and legal background. He told me about the county court's public access terminal and about a few databases that were freely searchable if you knew what you were looking for. I spent 3 Saturday mornings at the public library. What I found wasn't criminal, but it was a pattern. Lydia had been engaged once before, 5 years ago in Connecticut. The relationship had ended after approximately 14 months, roughly coinciding with the sale of her former fiancé's property, a lakefront cottage his family had owned for decades, following what appeared to have been a period of significant financial pressure. I couldn't prove anything, but the shape of it sat with me. I also found 2 civil complaints filed against her in small claims court, both by former clients, both citing misrepresentation during property transactions. Both had been settled quietly. I printed everything out. I put it in a manila folder in my desk drawer. I still wasn't sure what to do with it. The wedding was the 2nd Saturday of September. The ceremony was held outdoors, in a meadow behind the barn, with white chairs set in rows and late summer flowers everywhere. My son looked like the best version of himself. I sat in the front row in a suit I'd had dry cleaned and told myself to be present, to be grateful, to let things unfold. The reception was inside the barn. String lights, a band that played acoustic covers, speeches from the best man and the maid of honor. Both lovely. My son danced with a looseness I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. My toast was scheduled for 7 o'clock. I had written something careful and warm. I'd talked about his mother, about raising him alone after she died, about the kind of man he'd become. I'd included Lydia in the warmest terms I honestly could manage. But Lydia spoke first. She stood up before the MC had called for me, took the microphone from the stand, and turned to face the room with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. She talked about the wedding, about love, about the future. And then she began to talk about family, about how a new marriage means a new chapter, new priorities, new structures. She talked about how important it was for a young couple to have stability. Financial stability, she said, looking briefly but deliberately in my direction, and how fortunate they were to have options available to them going forward. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. The room felt it anyway. A few of her friends smiled knowingly. A few of my son's friends looked confused. My son looked at his hands. I understood then with complete clarity what she was doing. She was telling the room, telling my son in front of everyone, that the house was already part of her calculation, that she had already decided what options meant, that I was a variable she had accounted for. She handed back the microphone and sat down to applause. I sat very still for a moment. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket, took out my phone, found the number I had saved 3 months ago, and pressed call. I'd spent a long time thinking about the right moment to act. Not out of spite. I want to be clear about that, but out of the same logic Lydia herself had taught me. Timing is everything. You don't show your hand before the cards are on the table. She had just put her cards on the table, in front of 110 witnesses, at her own wedding reception. The call went to voicemail on the first try. I waited 90 seconds and called again. He answered on the second ring. I spoke quietly but clearly. The man on the other end of the line was a former colleague of Lydia's, someone she had worked with at a real estate firm in Hartford before moving to Massachusetts. We had connected through a mutual contact 6 weeks earlier, and when I'd first reached out, he'd been cautious. But when I told him what I'd found in the public records, he had told me something in return. Something that hadn't made it into any public filing. He had been asked by Lydia during a transaction 3 years ago to backdate a document. He had refused. She had found someone else who didn't refuse. The transaction had closed. The client had later lost money they hadn't expected to lose. The colleague had carried the knowledge of it ever since, not knowing what to do. He was willing to talk. He just needed a reason. I told him the reason was that my son was going to sign a joint title document in 30 days if something didn't change tonight. He said he understood. I said, "I'm going to hand this phone to someone in a moment, and I'd like you to tell him what you told me." I stood up from the table. My son looked up when I approached. Lydia's expression shifted when she saw the phone in my hand, though she couldn't have known yet what it meant. I said, "Son, I need a minute with you, outside." He hesitated. He looked at Lydia. She gave him a small nod that was meant to look like permission but was actually a warning. He came with me anyway. We stood outside the barn doors in the cooling September air, the music muffled behind us. The stars were out. I could hear crickets in the field. I handed him the phone and said, "Please listen to this man. He's going to tell you something I should have found a way to tell you sooner. I'm sorry for the timing. I'm not sorry for the truth." My son looked at me for a long moment. Then he put the phone to his ear. I stepped back and gave him space. I watched his face while he listened. I watched it go through several things: confusion, then concentration, then something harder. He asked a few questions, short ones. Yes or no answers, mostly. He thanked the man and ended the call. He stood there holding my phone, not looking at me. "How long have you known?" he said finally. "The phone call in February," I said. "But I didn't have anything solid until about 2 months ago. Why didn't you?" He stopped. He already knew the answer. He knew himself well enough to know the answer. "I needed you to be able to hear it," I said. "I'm sorry I couldn't find a better time." He handed me back my phone. He looked at the barn doors. Through the windows, we could see the lights inside, the guests moving around, Lydia laughing at something with a friend. He stood like that for a long time. I didn't rush him. He was my son, and he was in pain, and there was nothing I could do about the pain except be there for it. "I need to go back inside," he said. "I know. I need to talk to her. I know." He looked at me. "You could have lost me over this, Dad. I know that too." He went back inside. I stayed out there for a few minutes, listening to the crickets, feeling the night air on my face. My knees ached a little the way they always do in September now. I thought about his mother, how she would have handled this, whether she would have done anything differently. I think she would have waited too. She always said the truth doesn't need you to fight for it. It just needs you to keep it alive until the right moment. What happened inside that barn in the next hour is not my story to tell. Some of it I heard later. Some of it I pieced together. My son spoke to Lydia privately in a back room. He asked her direct questions. She denied certain things and deflected others. He asked to see her phone. She refused. That refusal, he told me afterward, was the moment it became real to him. The guest knew something had shifted when the couple didn't return to the dance floor. By 9 o'clock, people were quietly collecting their things. The band stopped early. The caterers packed up. A few of her friends left without speaking to anyone on our side. My son came to find me before I left. He looked hollowed out, the way you look when something you believed in has come apart at the seams. He looked like he had when he was 14 and his baseball team lost the regional championship, except 40 years older and 1,000 times more serious. He hugged me. He held on for a while. I let him. "I'm staying at the house tonight," he said. "Your old room is made up," I told him. "I'll make eggs in the morning." He pulled back and looked at me. "You had clean sheets in the room?" "I changed them last week." He almost laughed. Not quite. But almost. We drove separately. He arrived before me and was sitting on the porch steps when I pulled into the driveway, tie loosened, jacket over his arm, looking up at the old colonial in the dark, the way I had looked at it 1,000 times over 30 years. Like it was the one fixed thing in a world that kept moving. I sat down next to him. We didn't talk much. Just sat there in the dark the way we used to after baseball games or hard days at school, when he was young and words weren't necessary between us yet. I've thought about how much of a father's job is just being present, how much of love is just showing up consistently for long enough that someone knows they can find you when they need to. She looked at this house like it was a listing, he said quietly. I know. That first Sunday. Yes. He was quiet again. An owl called somewhere back in the tree line. The neighbor's porch light was on down the street. I'm gonna be okay, he said. There wasn't a question. I know you are, I said. You always are. We went inside eventually. I made chamomile tea. I bought some, finally. And we sat at the kitchen table for another hour. He talked when he needed to, and I listened, and that was enough. By midnight, he was asleep in his old room, and I was sitting alone in the kitchen with my tea gone cold, thinking about all the ways things could have gone differently. I don't take pleasure in any of it. I want to say that clearly, because I know that's not an obvious thing in a story like this. He was in real pain. He had planned a future, and that future had to be unmade in the span of one evening. No father looks at that and feels anything close to satisfaction. But I do feel something when I think about what might have happened if I'd stayed quiet. If I'd told myself it wasn't my place. If I'd been too afraid of losing him to tell him the truth. I've known men who made that choice, who swallowed what they knew and lived with the consequences for years. I didn't want to be one of those men. The legal process that followed was straightforward because they hadn't yet signed a joint property agreement. There was no marriage license issued. The officiant had not yet filed the certificate, which in Massachusetts takes a few days, and my son contacted the town clerk Monday morning to halt the process. They had not purchased property together. There were no joint accounts. It was painful, but it was clean. My son spent 2 weeks with me while he got his bearings. We ate breakfast together every morning. I let him use the study as a workspace. He went for long runs in the neighborhood the way he used to when he was in college and needed to think, slowly. Day by day, he started to look like himself again. One morning in October, almost exactly a year after that first Sunday dinner, he came down to the kitchen while I was making coffee. He sat at the table and looked out the bay window at the backyard, the way Lydia had looked at it the night she stood in the doorway. But where her look had been calculating, his was something else entirely. I really do love this house, he said. I poured him a cup and set it in front of him. I know, I said. So do I. That was enough. That was everything, actually. That simple sentence between a father and his son on an October morning, with coffee and cold light coming through old windows in a house that no one was going to take from either of us. I'm 63 years old. I've buried a wife, raised a son alone, and worked long enough to earn a quiet retirement. I'm not a dramatic man. I don't make speeches. I'm not the kind of father who says I told you so, or who counts the cost of doing the right thing. But I will say this, to any father listening who is sitting on something he knows and doesn't know how to say, the truth is patient, but it doesn't wait forever. And the right moment when it comes is usually not the moment you planned. You'll know it when it arrives. Pick up the phone. I've thought about this a lot since that September night. Not obsessively, I'm too old for that. But the way you turn a smooth stone over in your hand when you're sitting on a porch with nothing pressing to do, quietly, carefully. What Lydia did wasn't a mystery. It wasn't evil in some dramatic, unrecognizable way. It was something much more ordinary and, in some ways, much more dangerous. She made a plan and she stuck to it. She was disciplined. She was patient. She looked at my son and saw something real. His kindness, his steadiness, his willingness to love without holding back. And she made a decision about how to use those qualities. That's not the story of a monster. That's the story of someone who chose to be dishonest because they believed, probably correctly in many other cases, that no one would look closely enough to catch it. What I keep coming back to is this: she almost got away with it. Not because I wasn't paying attention, but because I came close, more than once, to talking myself out of what I was seeing. It's uncomfortable to trust your own instincts when you know you have something at stake. It's easy to call your own judgment biased. I was her future father-in-law. Of course I was going to be skeptical. Of course I was going to notice things I didn't like. The question was whether what I was noticing was real or just the ordinary resistance of a parent who doesn't want to let go. That question is worth sitting with. I sat with it for months, but here's what I've come to believe. After 63 years of being wrong about some things and right about others, there is a difference between discomfort and recognition. Discomfort is what you feel when something challenges you. Recognition is what you feel when something reveals itself. The two can look similar from the outside, but you know the difference on the inside. Lydia didn't make me uncomfortable. She made me recognize something. There's a clarity to that feeling that doesn't go away no matter how hard you try to explain it out of existence. My son is a good man, not because I raised him perfectly, I didn't, but because he has the kind of character that bends without breaking. When he put that phone to his ear and listened, he didn't fall apart. He got quiet, the way strong people get quiet when something hard lands. He asked the right questions. He went back inside and faced it. That takes something most people underestimate in themselves until they actually need it. I think about that a lot too, the resilience that lives in people without their knowing. You don't find out you have it by imagining difficult situations. You find out by going through them and discovering you're still standing on the other side. What I want to say to anyone who's carrying something heavy right now is that the truth is not fragile. It doesn't need you to protect it at every moment, but it does need you to keep it from disappearing. It needs you to hold it carefully, look at it honestly, and trust that the right moment to act will come, even if that moment is inconvenient, even if it's painful, even if it costs something you weren't planning to give. I wasn't trying to be a hero at that wedding. I was trying to be a father. Those are not always the same thing, but that night they were.